All right, so now let's talk about how a defense attorney or even a prosecutor, when they first got the case, basically after Brian Winchester confessed to what he did and he implicated Denise Williams, what sort of considerations would they have to make as they evaluated the case, as they evaluated how to prosecute the case? So I outlined a few of the issues that they would have thought about. First of all, Denise Williams reported that her husband was missing on a hunting trip in which he went out hunting alone. She must have said that he went out hunting alone because there's no evidence that was suggested that there was any inquiries at the very beginning about whether somebody was with him. I think it was always treated as he went hunting on his own. And so the question then would be, this was Mike going to hunt on the date of the anniversary between Mike and Denise. The plan for them was that he would go hunting, and then later in the day they would go on a trip together to Apalachicola and stay in a hotel and celebrate the anniversary. So would she not know? Because now we have Brian's confession, and we know that Brian's version was that obviously Mike and Brian had a plan to go hunting together. So would Denise know about that? And common sense would dictate that she did know. That she did know that she was going to go hunting with Brian. And that if she was telling everybody that he went hunting alone, therefore she was covering for Brian. There's a possibility at least that she did not know, and that's something to be noted. But that was, in essence, a very key factor because it affects everything else. Because if Denise knew that Brian was going to go hunting with Mike, then there's pretty much no way that she wasn't implicated on this thing. And that she would later marry the guy knowing that he was a suspect because she would know that they were together. So for her to be innocent, then she must not have known. I separated the analysis in two parts. The first one is in the event that Brian was lying about the affair, so therefore there was no affair, no pre-murder affair between Brian and Denise. And then the second part would be, well, yes, there was an affair and Brian was truthful about it, but could Denise still be innocent? So in the no affair scenario, it really depends on the relationship between Denise and Mike, and the issue of the no affair is not really that important as to whether or not she knew about whether he was hunting. If there was an affair, however, then so if the evidence would suggest and prove that she did have an affair with Brian before the murder, then you start to think, okay, well, how could she not know, A, that her husband was going hunting with Brian, and B, that her lover Brian was going to go hunting with her husband? So then it becomes really incredulous to think that she did not know. Again, it's still possible, but it just makes it more likely that she knew, and I guess a little bit easier for the prosecution from a common sense perspective. The second issue is what would be Brian's motives to kill Mike if, for example, there was no affair? If there was no affair, basically if he was lying about a pre-murder affair, then you got to think that Brian was a totally sick guy who was totally obsessed with Denise, who wanted her, who didn't succeed in having anything with her before the murder, but just expected that if she just got Mike out of the way, somehow he would eventually get her to fall in love with him. You have to strain your imagination to get there, but I guess in the overall analysis of whether Denise was involved, you also have to think about what sense did Brian have did what he did all on his own. If she was not in it, if she was not in an agreement with him that in a few years they would be together and live happily ever after. The next issue is, why did she marry Brian, right? So if there was no affair, at least pre-murder, then it would be more likely that she innocently fell in love with Brian. Now, Brian did engage in some, strange behavior while Denise was supposedly dating some other guy a couple of years after the murder, some Chuck Bunker guy. Brian followed her to Atlanta, confronted Denise. Apparently Denise then stayed with Brian. So obviously there was, at a minimum, some kind of affair or something going on after the murder where the relationship hadn't been disclosed yet, but Brian felt betrayed by Denise. Overall, it just doesn't look good, right? I mean, you have the person who later confesses to killing your husband, and you marry that guy, and you let that guy raise his victim's child. It's just a horrible fact, and it basically makes it very hard to swallow the fact that she didn't know anything. Possible? Still yes. I mean, you have to look at the overall evidence, but that is a really, really bad fact for Denise that I think really made this almost a slam dunk for the prosecution, which basically means that really you really didn't have to have too much more evidence than you have all the, she had all the motives. She married the guy who killed her husband. She let the guy raise her kid. And why wouldn't she know that Mike went hunting with Brian? So anyway, but of course there is one more way that maybe there can be some reasonable doubt as to whether Denise was involved in the killing. It's what happened after she was kidnapped at gunpoint while they were while they were going through a divorce, and Brian Winchester waited for her in her car, in her SUV, scared her in the middle of the night in the dark with a gun, supposedly with a sheet, maybe with bleach. It wasn't clear at trial, and told her to drive somewhere. One would think that he was planning to do the same with Denise, right? So the question is, what would be the state of mind of Denise at that time? So how does that fact play into the whole situation? The fact that he did this, she convinced him to let her go, and then she went to the police. So if I'm the prosecutor, I'm thinking like this. I'm thinking, number one, the reason why Brian let her go is because they have a deal. And he doesn't think that she's going to go to the police over this kidnapping because they were co-murderers. So why would she go to the police at all? Also, if I'm a prosecutor, I would think, if Denise knows that Brian is a killer, then she's taking this really for real. And to her, she has to choose between staying alive or turning him in and risking that he would talk. And between the two, what's the best option? You always want to have self-preservation, so you want to be alive. So as a prosecutor, I would think, okay, well, that fact that, I can turn that fact in my favor. From the defense perspective, then the analysis would be, well, wait a second. If they were on this deal together, and if he had the goods on her, why the heck would she turn him in, and why the heck would she want him to stay in prison and all of that? And that's kind of one of the approaches that the defense did at trial. But it fell flat, and she was convicted. Anyway, these are some of the issues a prosecutor or defense attorney would think about in analyzing how to prosecute and or defend the case. Now, we're going to evaluate how the state prosecuted it, what evidence it presented to support these theories, and also how the defense defended it, and how either side could have done a better job. Thank you. Please subscribe.